अभी तो कोई नहीं आया।
So can you see my screen?
Yes, yes, I can see.
Okay. And you can hear me properly.
Yes, yes. Please let them know how you want to handle the questions.
Yeah, sure.
In between or towards.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will spell that out.
Mhm.
So shall I start?
Yes, yes.
ठीक है, स्टार्ट और ये बाद में करती हूँ ना, इतना तो हो ही गया।
Somebody please mute. Somebody is speaking. There's some noise. I request all the participants to mute. If you have any questions, you can unmute and then speak. Yeah, I think we are good to go.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So thanks, Biswesh. So I'll be talking about CAS hierarchy. It's just a continuation to the topics that you have been listening, especially from Gobind and Arka. So before I start, it's a warm welcome from my side. And then before we forget, it's a kudos to the organizing team for putting off such a nice program, though it's called as the Winter School, but I am calling it as a carnival of computer architecture. Okay, 2 weeks of non-stop lectures and labs, but make sure at the end of the winter school you connect all the dots. Otherwise, you may miss the trees for the jungle. Okay. Before I start talking about the technicalities, few protocol that we will try to follow. You can post your questions anytime on the MS team. I'll be looking into it. I'll be monitoring it. And throughout my talk, there will be multiple breaks. So there are like breakpoints. So at every breakpoint, we will pause and we'll take all the questions that are asked till that breakpoint. Okay. And it's perfectly fine if I fail to cover all the slides, or if you are running out of time. But it's better to actually have a debate or discussion kind of thing instead of a simple lecture kind of ambience where I'm just talking and you are just listening. Okay. So we have sufficient time. We have 4,500 seconds to discuss about cases. That's actually too much if you think from a microarchitect point of view, where we deal with 4 nanoseconds, forget about seconds. Last but not the least, Winter School is just a platform to showcase or to make you educate about various technology or the basic concept. So if you are still struggling with something during or after the Winter School, feel free to reach out. Okay. So with that, let me start with the notion of CAS or CAS hierarchy. So Govind must have talked about a notion of a processor, bit of pipelining, out of order, speculative execution, branch predictor, and blah, blah, blah. So in this lecture, we'll assume all those things are subsumed into this black box called a core. Okay. And you can also see a green color DIMM, which is actually known as the DRAM. I think Madhu or Vivek will be talking about DRAM tomorrow, but for the timing, you can actually treat it as a green box. Okay. And the way we'll have all our discussion is basically because modern processors, they actually interact with the DRAM to get the data or the code, right? So the way they talk to each other is a core will actually send an address. Let's make it pretty simple, a 32-bit address. And after a few amount of time, let's call it few hundreds of cycles, the DRAM will respond with the data, right? So minimizing this costly DRAM accesses, because you must have looked at the basic slides that Govind or Arka would have talked about. Even one cycle is actually pretty crucial for the performance improvement, but now we are talking about hundreds of cycles, right? So minimizing this costly DRAM accesses is actually critical for performance, and then that is kind of the main motivation for this lecture. So before we jump into the various terminology, let's understand why it's a bottleneck, and bottleneck in the form of what. So there are two fundamental terms that comes to any computer systems or any architect's mind whenever we talk about bottleneck, is the bottleneck in the form of latency and bandwidth. So latency is nothing but the amount of time you take to get the data or fetch the data from any particular device or any particular resource. And bandwidth is how fast you can actually respond. You know, how fast can you pump the data back, let's say in this case, from DRAM to the processor, right? So both of them are kind of correlated, if not directly, but indirectly they affect each other. And we'll try to see how this bottleneck can be mitigated, if not completely, through the notion of caching. Okay, so just a quote to emphasize the importance of a latency problem compared to a bandwidth problem. So bandwidth problems are actually, if you are following the current literature, you will find DRAM bandwidth is kind of increasing regularly. Every 2 years, you will find the DRAM bandwidth is actually going up. That means the DRAM can actually pump data at a faster rate and send the data to the processor. But the latency is still more or less the fix. Okay. And that makes a latency problem a harder problem to solve compared to a bandwidth problem. But you can also ask a simple question, right? Why to access memory? We can just get rid of accessing memory because it's taking hundreds of cycles. Well, this is the von Neumann model that we are discussing here, where the idea is the data and the code is actually sitting in memory. Whenever processor wants to execute the code, whenever the processor it's in need of data, then it has to send a request to the DRAM and then get the data. But yeah, as I have been mentioning from the beginning of the presentation, is this is actually a bottleneck because it's taking hundreds of cycles, and in multi-core system it can become thousands of cycles, right? So literally, it has created a notion of wall, which is known as the memory wall, and then it's one of the famous walls in the field of computer architecture, and it's still an open problem to solve, like how to mitigate DRAM latency, right? Caching at a pretty 50,000 feet view. We'll slowly go into the 5 feet view, but caching is a technique which is a speculation technique. It speculates something, and based on that speculation, it assumes that a subset of data or subset of code can be stored in a small memory compared to a bigger gigantic DRAM, and so that can be accessed in few cycles and not hundreds of cycles. So in this case, you can see that if your DRAM is of 4 GB, you can actually put few KBs here, and the speculation is those 4 KB will be useful, right? But there should be some basis or rationale for this speculation, right? Why this speculation should work. This speculation works because our programs have some form of locality. So to understand what's the locality, let's look at this plot where the y-axis shows the memory addresses or the loads which are generated by the processor. X-axis shows the notion of time. Okay, and if you look at this particular line, it shows that a particular address is getting accessed or reaccessed again and again, right? So this is the notion of temporal locality. So which means if you put this particular address or the data corresponding to that address in cache, you will be able to get the data from cache, and there is no need to go to the DRAM. Similarly, you will find spatial locality. So whenever you are accessing a particular address, there is a high probability that you are also accessing the nearby addresses. Thereby, if you bring the nearby addresses into the cache, it's highly likely that you will get benefit. Okay. Having said that, as I mentioned in my definition, it's a speculation technique. Okay, so you should not assume that caching will help all the time. It will only help if your program has locality. Otherwise, it won't. Okay. So with that, let's move on and let's look at some of the examples that you can correlate in your programming that you use. So let's say instructions within a loop. You can see this kind of access patterns. Stack accesses, basically a function or subroutine call. You are entering into function, doing something inside the function and coming back, right? And similar like scalar or vector accesses, you can easily correlate with access related to let's say A of I or A of ij, right? So these are the typical examples that you will be able to correlate with the notion of locality, both spatial and temporal locality. Okay. So so far what we have discussed is our programs have locality. And we can actually solve the memory wall problem by bringing a notion of cache. But I should also give you a tip that just reduction of DRAM accesses doesn't mean that you will get improvement in your performance or improvement in your execution time. Okay, so as I have mentioned before, just few minutes before, it may happen that your program is actually not memory intensive. Right? What if it's not accessing memory at all? It's actually performing so many arithmetic operations, and most of the operations are actually on the registers, right? So no matter how many caches you put, you won't be able to see any difference, right? So this is the first law of performance that you should keep in mind, that make the common case fast, right? And here the common case is the intuitive case. If your program is actually going for DRAM again and again, then that's the common case. Okay, if it is not going, then there is no point putting caches for improving the performance. Okay, so once we decide that, okay, we need a cache, the obvious things that comes to our mind is how big should be the cache, how much time it will take to get the data from the cache. But if you look at the design aspects of cache, you'll find that these are kind of conflicting requirements. So you can't have a bigger cache with lower latency, right? So whenever you go for a bigger cache, you will find that the latency is also high, right? It takes more time to search for a data. But if you go for a smaller cache, the capacity will be low, but you will be able to respond to the core in a few cycles, okay? Maybe in tens of cycles or less than 10 cycles, right? So this is kind of a trade-off that we kind of have to debate and decide what should be the size of the cache, what should be the latency, right? So we can actually pause a bit asking these questions, but this is for you. You can actually pause later when you go through this slide, right? I'm not going into the technicalities of how cache is implemented, whether it's using SRAM array, DRAM array, blah, blah, blah. That's not the goal of this particular lecture, but feel free to look into these aspects also. What I would emphasize in this lecture is, let's ask the processor core what will be the best size of a cache from processor's point of view, okay? So this is a 1000 feet view of an out of order processor. So here O3 corresponds to out of order, okay? I'm showing 5 instructions which are getting fetched one by one, okay, in order. And you can actually fetch multiple instructions in one cycle. Arka would have talked about issue width of 4, 5, whatever, right? And now the modern processor, they actually execute instructions out of order as long as there is no dependency. Okay, so in this case, there are 3 loads which are actually going to access cache or memory. The other 2 are actually arithmetic operations they are performing on registers. But the bottleneck comes because we complete or we kind of commit the instructions in the program order. So what I meant to emphasize here is, even if the sub instruction and sub and mul instructions are actually done in 2 cycles, they won't be able to complete, or their effect won't be visible to the programmer unless the first load is done, because we are kind of completing in order, right? Just to respect the programmer's view of instructions, right? So one DRAM can actually create a bottleneck for rest of the instruction, even if they are independent. That's the key here, right? So ideally, the processor should get all the data in, let's say, 1 or 2 cycles, right? So that's the answer from the processor point of view. Just to understand the impact of DRAM access in a more better way, but maybe through a bit hypothetical example, let's talk about a 4 fetch issue processor, which means in one cycle you are fetching 4 instructions. And let's assume the frequency of the processor is 4 gigahertz. Okay. And what you can see here is, if we have a DRAM of latency 100 nanoseconds, in one DRAM access, you can actually correlate it to you can correlate one DRAM access to 1600 instructions. Okay, so just to spell it out, this calculation. So we are talking about a 4 gigahertz processor. So that means it's a 0.25 nanosecond clock cycle time. It's a 4-fetch issue processor, right? That means in 1 nanosecond, you will be able to fetch 16 instructions, provided there is no bottleneck, right? But because the DRAM is taking 100 nanosecond, it may happen that you will be blocked and you won't be able to do anything for, let's say, the next 1600 instructions, right? This is a hypothetical example. Modern processors, they have an upper limit in the form of the ROB. Govind must have talked about it. So after a few hundreds of instructions, the pipeline will just stop fetching new instructions. Okay. So if now we have got the answer that the processor demands everything should be available in few cycles. Yeah, definitely less than 10 cycles, right? And for that, we should have a smaller cache. We can't have a bigger cache because that will add latency into picture, right? So instead, what we can have is we can have a hierarchy of caches. And the notion of, or the intuition behind this hierarchy is the latency will go up as you move away from the processor, right? And the capacity will also go up, right? And you can actually keep on adding more and more cache levels with the hope that the processor will either get a hit here or here or here. But there is a trade-off. You can't just keep on adding these cache levels, because it may happen that suddenly you may reach a point where getting the data from DRAM is better than getting the data from the cache, right? So that's the trade-off. So you can actually create a cost-benefit analysis equation, and suddenly you will find that, okay, if I add a 5th level cache, that is equivalent to going to DRAM. So that it's not worth it. Let's stop at, let's say, L1, L2, L3, L4 as 4 levels of cache. Okay. So, so far, the takeaways that we have is we have discussed about the notion of caches and cache hierarchy. The message that you should keep in mind is the private caches or the smaller caches are actually designed keeping latency and bandwidth in mind. But the last level cache or the cache which is closer to the memory, it's actually designed keeping capacity in mind. Okay. With that, I will pause and I will be happy to take questions before we move forward. Any questions?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please go on.
Sir, how are you relating locality, temporal locality and spatial locality along with that along in that 10th slide with that some kind of graphs now? How are you?
Let me go to that slide. Okay. 10th. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Means how are you relating that that upper one will be temporal locality and downwards will be that spatial locality?
Yeah. So the notion of temporal locality is you are actually accessing the same address again and again. The x-axis is time, right?
Okay.
So that means the same address, let's say address 100 is getting accessed again and again, right? So that's why it's a temporal locality. But here you can see there is a direction in which the program is going in the upward direction. Whenever you access, let's say address 21, you are also accessing 22, 23, 24, 25 like that, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sir. So I thought it is some kind of scratch.
What do you mean by scratch?
Scratch means like.
No, this is actually it's actually a real program access pattern. So you can actually take your program and actually see this kind of access patterns.
So how we do that? Means how can I see these things? Means
maybe in the afternoon during the lab we can tell you. Okay.
Okay, sir. Yeah. Yes. Sir. Thank you, sir.
Any more questions? Okay, so there is a question from Aditya. Is it possible to have something like a continuous distribution of memory access using 5 bits mean for L0, 10 bits mean for L2, so that we can access from the same memory pool but have a larger pool of memory access? Okay, in the interest of time, I would just answer yes. And if you dig deep into the current design, you will find that the question that you are asking and the design that modern processor use is actually the same. They actually use the same rationale that you are asking here. But in the interest of time, I will delay answering this. Maybe we can take it offline or one-on-one, right? More questions before I move on? Okay, so I'm assuming we are good to go. Okay, so so far we have discussed that there is a cache, but we haven't discussed how exactly the data is stored in the cache, and how can the processor or the core can actually get the data by providing an address. Okay. So a typical high-level view of a cache is something like this. You can actually correlate this with a box, and then one box collecting of multiple small boxes, and each small box is actually of, let's say, 1 byte. Okay, so that's the information that processor is interested in. And then there's the notion of line or a block, which is nothing but collection of multiple bytes, right? So you can actually assume like this particular yellow color is actually one line, which is consisting of, let's say, 6 bytes. Okay. Typically, a modern processor will have cache line size of 64 to 128 bytes. Okay, this is again to exploit the spatial locality, right? So if you are accessing few data, then there is highly likely that you will be accessing the nearby data. So let's look at how processor will interact. So the core sends a 32-bit address. Now, so far we have discussed that the data is actually arranged in the form of lines. Okay, and each line contains multiple bytes. So in this slide, I'm showing a cache which 1024 lines, and each line is of 32 byte. Okay, so our first job should be which line the data in one of these lines the data is actually present. So we should find a way to get the data from one of these lines, right? So since there are 1024 lines, you need actually 10 bits to find out which of the lines are actually of lines of interest, right? Or maybe one of the line is actually line of interest. So if you take this 32-bit, and then you should have 10 bits somewhere which can tell you, okay, go to this line number and get the data, right? Second thing is your programmer or your processor may not demand a 32-byte data request, right? It may demand a byte or 2 byte. You can correlate with your different data types, right? Integer, character, floating point, and blah, blah, blah. So it may happen that you are demanding few bytes and not 32 bytes. So for that, you should have 5 bits to find out which particular byte you are interested in, right? So let's look at that in more detail. So we had a 32-bit address, and we have chopped off few bits for offset to find out which byte within a line, then few bits for finding out which line that we should go for. And the rest of the bits are actually known as the tag bits. Why we need the rest of the bits? Remember, cache is actually storing a subset of data, not the entire DRAM content, right? So unless you compare the address which is coming from the processor with the address that is there in the cache completely, right? The entire 32 bits should match. Then only you will be sure that, okay, this is the data I'm interested in, right? So that's the job of a tag bit, right? So you should actually compare the tag, and once it's a hit, that means, yeah, I am actually accessing the data for the address that I was interested in, then you can extract the data, right? So this arrangement is actually known as direct mapped cache because for each line, there is a one-to-one mapping with the index bits, right? So that there is a one-on-one mapping between index and a line number, okay? So let's see how it happens. So you got a 32-bit address from the processor. First, you actually extract the index bit. Index bit will actually give you the line number. So in this case, let's say the line number is 1. The next thing that you should do is you compare the tag bits, which is also stored in cache, and compare with the tag bits which is coming from the processor. If it is matching, then it's a hit. Then you can actually extract the corresponding data, right? So there are three events of interest here. Compare the index bits, extract the index bits, compare the tag bits, and then finally extract the data, right? So this is a question for you that you can think about it later. Why not have this kind of address mapping, right? Why to have tag bits at the upper or MSB side? Why not at the, let's say, LSB side, right? So try to correlate with this particular code snippet, and if it makes sense. If not, feel free to ask me maybe later or during the lab. Okay. So we can actually extend the definition of our line into a new dimension called a set. Okay. And now the definition of set is its collection of multiple lines. So remember, we started with the notion of 1 byte. Then we said there is something called a line, which is collection of multiple bytes. Now we are saying there is something called a set, which is collection of multiple lines. Okay. And now the index bits, they will provide a set number instead of a line number. Now it's your job to find out which particular line actually is storing your data. The set number will just provide multiple ways to find out the data. That's why it's called a way associative cache. Okay. So in this case, I am showing a two-way associative cache where a given set consists of two cache lines. Okay. So let's see how it works. Similar event that I have discussed before for direct map cache. You extract the index bit that will actually give you a set number. But now since we are dealing with a two-way set associative cache, now there are two different cache lines, right? And two different tags for a given set. So what you need to do is you need to compare the tag for both the lines. Whichever line gives you a hit, you extract the data from that particular line. Okay, so basically you need a multiplexer or a selector to finally extract the data from a particular line. So this two-way associative cache can be extended to, let's say, 4-way, 8-way, or 16-way. So it has its own trade-offs. Modern processors, you will find all L1, L2, L3 caches are actually set associative caches. Okay. And this is just again for your reference. You can actually go and have a look when you have time. Nothing different. It's a 4-way associative cache. So in one go, you are actually comparing 4 different tags. And then finally, depending on whichever tag gives you a hit, you are extracting the data, right? So now you can actually think about the latency part. The direct map cache doesn't have so many comparisons happening parallelly, and then the direct map cache doesn't need a multiplexer because there is a one-to-one mapping. But now you have this additional thing, so that will actually increase your access latency. Okay. Another way to look at what we have discussed so far, if you are a fan of Sherlock Holmes, is the index bits actually they are giving you, or they are providing you, the street address, and the tag bits is actually corresponding to the famous number 221B, and finally the data is actually the byte offset. Okay, and then in this case that's the famous name Sherlock Holmes, right? So see if it helps in correlating the different bits and pieces that we have discussed so far, right? So the final extreme case in case of organizing a cache is a fully associative cache, which is not implemented in modern processors for various reasons that you can easily find out. So here there is no mapping, so that's why there is no index bit. So you get an address, and the idea here is your data can present anywhere, right? So it may be present in any cache line, right? So then what you need to do, you need to compare the tag of every line which is present in the cache, and whichever line provides a hit, you go and get the data from that line, right? So as you can imagine, this is super expensive because you need tons of comparators, and you need a gigantic multiplexer or a hierarchical multiplexer to extract the data, right? So the takeaway here is modern processor, they use set-way associative caches. Okay, sorry, k-way associative caches. The k can be 2, 4, 8, or 16. And then direct map cache and fully associative caches are kind of two extremes of organizing or designing a cache, right? So this is the summary. This is how a processor sends an address and kind of extracts or interact with the cache. And these are the three bits or three chunks of interest, depending on whether it's a direct mapped cache or a fully associative cache, or you can play with the associativity by increasing the number of ways, right? So this is just a summary for you. You can again go back and then see through it, right? So again, I will pause and I'll take questions before we move on.
Sir, I have a question.
Sure.
So, like, what is the most commonly used set associative in real systems?
So if you look at for private caches, they are kind of 4 to 8 ways. Private meaning the caches which are closer to a processor, like L1 and L2. You will find 4 to 8 or maximum 12 in L2. But the last level L3 cache is typically 16-way associative. Okay.
Okay, sir.
So,
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah, go on.
So accessing cache, it requires lots of power, isn't it? Because
Yes.
of embedding so much.
Yeah. So what's your question? It's just a clarification?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah. It will demand power because you are actually using. But that's not the purview of this lecture. But yes, you are doing so many activities to get the data from the cache, right? So obviously it will demand power. Yeah. Anything more?
So another thing.
Yeah, sure.
Sir, do programmers have to be aware of the cache association? I mean, to exploit the features fully, do they have to know what cache mechanisms the processor is using or something?
No, so that's a good question, right? So you have been writing programs, right? Don't you?
Yes.
But you can just write a program even without the knowledge of cache hierarchy. But having said that, if you are aware of the cache hierarchy, the line size, the associativity, you will be a better programmer, right? When you declare your data structures or when you access your data structures, you can actually keep it in mind that these accesses will actually exploit temporal or spatial locality. So it's better to write in this way compared to, let's say, some other ways, right? So I don't have slides which talks about the beauty of cache aware programming. Maybe I will share some slides after the session, and you can see the impact if you are aware of these things that I'm talking about.
Okay, sir.
Okay, so there are few on chat. Can you repeat the function of tag bits? Okay, so I think the confusion comes. I don't have a chalkboard here, but let's see. See, if we don't have a tag, then what we have block offset and index bits, right? But the processor is actually demanding the data for a 32-bit address, no, not for this point, till the index bit, right? So what you need to have is you should actually store this tag bits so that when the request comes from processor, you should be sure that the address that the processor is demanding and the address that you have stored in cache, they are actually the same. Because so far you have just compared the index bit that tells you a subset of address, not the entire address, right? And that's why you need to store the tag and compare the tag. Is that clear, Gautam? Let me know if it is not clear. Okay, thanks. There is a question from Anmol. Speaking from RTL perspective, are there any specific architectures for muxes and comparators which are preferred? Yeah, so I'm not an RTL expert, so I can't give you, pretty subtle answers, but there will be libraries in modern world. There will be libraries which can provide you, variants of mux design, comparator design, or whatever keeping your area, energy, and then latency budget, right? So you have to just export those libraries and then see whether it fits into your budget, right? So that's my simple answer. Does that make sense, Anmol? Okay, thank you. Any further queries?
So one more.
Sure.
Whatever techniques we are using to compare, to get the address, each time we have to compare the entire of address, isn't it? Even if we subdivide the tag and do further things, each time we have to compare the entire address, like what the processor is sending and whatever there is in cache, isn't it?
We are not comparing the entire address. Actually, I didn't give them much detail. So if you look at this particular slide, right, the tags are actually stored separately from the data. So you can actually, compare the subpart instead of taking care of the entire address, right? So that the width of the comparator will also be small compared to having a 32-bit comparator, right? So in this case, the comparator will be of width which is needed for the tag, right? So yeah, theoretically you should compare the entire 32-bit, but practically we are dividing the 32-bit into multiple subfields, and we are just extracting and comparing those subfields.
But even in this case, we are using the entire address because cache index is telling something, byte select is telling something.
Yeah. That's the input to the memory, right? Because the memory operates based on address. You provide an address, memory will provide you data, right? So it has to operate on that address completely.
Okay.
Okay.
Sir, in 36 slide.
36. Okay.
Sir, is it that index and tag both are unique for each of the line in that stacks? Means for all the fours, there should be index and tag. Both are unique for all these things. All these.
No. So if you understand the associative cache, the index bits are actually same for all four, right? That's why all the 4 lines are part of same index.
Okay.
So there is
then
no tag bit is unique. Tag bit is unique per line, right?
per line.
That's why we are comparing with a comparator, whether the tag that is requested by the processor is actually matching with the tag that I have stored in my line.
Okay, means there should be same tag for all the 4 greens. There.
Different tags, right? Not same. If it is same, then what's the point of storing 4 different lines?
Okay. Different tags for all the 4s.
Yes, exactly.
And any one of them will have the data.
If they have, in the worst case, you may get a miss, right? All the comparators will say, no, we didn't get a hit. So that means the data is not there in the cache. You have to go to DRAM to get the data.
Okay.
Right?
Okay, understood.
Yeah.
Hello, sir.
Hey, your voice is a bit feeble. Could you be a bit louder?
Okay. Hello, sir.
Yeah. Now I can hear you.
Sir, you mentioned about cache-aware programming, and compiler can basically optimize the programs in order to exploit cache-aware programming. So, how does the compiler, in case of bytecode generated languages, know that this is the cache hierarchy used, or how does a compiler basically know how to exploit it?
See, compiler is nothing but intelligent programmer, right? So whatever we are discussing so far, or the answer that I gave to someone who was asking, is it better to be aware of this cache hierarchy while writing programs? So whatever you should have done while writing programs, now compiler can do that for you, blindly. So it can actually lay out the data structure in such a way that there will be more caches, there will be more locality, right? So you can take an example of let's say any linear data structures, let's say structures, array of structures, right? If you have coded in a bit messed up way, the compiler can actually rearrange the data layout so that you will get more hits. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay, so let's move on. Now that we have understood the notion of interaction between processor and cache, let's have a complete picture. And the picture here is the processor is accessing different kinds of cache. One is instruction cache, which is also known as the front end of the processor. Okay. And this cache sits closer to the fetch stage of the pipeline. Okay, so you can correlate with Govind's lecture and then why you need a instruction cache there. Okay, and for data, there is a data cache which is sitting, let's say, in your memory stage of the pipeline. If you think about the typical vanilla 5-stage pipeline, right? So they are actually called the front end of the pipeline or front end of the processor. And whenever you talk about the data, they are typically called as the back end of the data, right? And after that, both data and code are actually stored in a unified cache from L2 level. So L2 and LLC, which is the last level cache in the form of L3, they store both code and data, right? So now let's look at how exactly the interaction happens between processor, cache, and DRAM. So processor sends a request in the form of a load request. If there is a hit, the cache will respond in few cycles. If not, then it will actually be stalled, right? Because the DRAM access latency is in hundreds of cycles. But we are dealing with an out of order processor. That means there will be more and more requests coming in every cycle, right? And if one cache miss can stall the processor, then actually it's not a good design. So for that, what we have is something called MSHRs, which are known as the miss status holding registers. So the idea here is, even if you get a miss, you keep on responding to processors as long as this particular MSHR is not full. So what it is doing, it's actually allowing parallelism among misses. So if you get a request to X, you get a miss, you store it in this register. You get a request to Y, you also got a miss Y, you also got a miss at the cache, you also store that, right? But you are not telling the processor saying that I am done, I can't respond because I'm waiting for the data from DRAM, okay? And depending on the size of this MSHR, it provides the notion of parallelism, right? So Arka must have talked about instruction level parallelism. Here I'm talking about memory level parallelism, right? Multiple requests can go to DRAM in a different order, and they can also come back in different order. There is no need for in-order response, right? So this particular statement will be much more clearer after tomorrow's lecture once Madhu Vivek will talk about DRAM. But the takeaway message here is we have something called MSHRs, which tracks all the misses that comes to a particular cache. Okay?
This XYZ, these are addresses, right?
Yes, these are addresses. Yes. Okay. So as I mentioned, the response can be out of order. It may happen that the response for Y comes first. So in that case, you will remove that entry from the MSHR. Let's say after that Z comes, so you remove that entry. Then let's say finally X comes, right? So the beauty of this idea is even if you get multiple misses, the processor is still fetching the data. It's not stalled, right? So all the modern processors, they have MSHRs at all the cache levels like L1, L2, and L3. Now, what about writes or the stores when you want to update something into your memory? So on a store request, similar thing happens. If you get a hit, you are good to go. You can write in the cache itself. But if you get a miss, the store actually gets converted into a load, right? Because now you got a miss. So from cache point of view, it will generate a load request to the DRAM, right? And eventually the DRAM will respond with the data. And once it responds to the data, you kind of overwrite the data in the cache itself. And finally, when the particular line is kicked out because of capacity constraint or other constraint, then you update the data into DRAM. So that's why you need a buffer in between, because the speed at which you are sending data into the DRAM and the rate at which the DRAM is updating, it may be different. So you need a buffer for this, right? And this buffer is known as the write back buffer, because whenever you are evicting or kicking out something from the cache, you are putting into the buffer. saying that go and update DRAM. Okay. Remember, the processor is not waiting for this particular operation to be over. Okay. The processor will be done once it writes in the cache itself. Okay. So again, I will pause if there are few quick questions, maybe for a minute or two, just on the interaction of load and store and the MSHRs. If not, in the interest of time, maybe I'll just move on. Okay, so
Yeah,
we
is
talked.
it like
Yeah,
hello?
please go on. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, sorry, sir. Yeah, is it like a FIFO, like the write back buffer with multi-clock, like because both are different clocks, if they're operating at different speed?
Yeah. This is
Okay,
a simple
okay,
FIFO. Yeah, this is simple.
okay,
Yeah.
cool. Thank you.
So as you have mentioned from the beginning, right? The caches are of limited size. They are not same as the DRAM capacity. So it may happen that you will get misses, and unless your working set or the memory requirement is pretty small, like few KBs, right? So there are various kinds of misses, and the misses come in the form of capacitive miss, conflict miss, and something called a compulsory miss. So capacity miss, as the name suggests, if you're getting a miss because your capacity is not sufficient. Conflict miss is when there are multiple cache lines, they are mapped to the same set, and because of which you're getting a conflict, the data is not there in the cache, right? And compulsory miss or the cold miss is the very first time when you access something from the cache is empty, so you're bound to get a miss, right? Coherence miss, I won't talk about it now. I think Arka or Govind will talk about it sometime next week. Okay. On a miss, there is a policy that kicks in. That policy is known as a replacement policy because we have a fixed size cache, and if something is getting missed, we have to bring a new block. So we should decide what to replace. So it's a collection of three sub policies. First one is eviction policy. So for a given set, if you have, let's say, 8-way associative cache and now you get a miss, that means you need to have space for the new block, which will be coming, right? So the eviction policy can be a simple LRU policy that many of you may be familiar with. It will actually go and replace the least recently used block, okay? And then once the new block comes from the memory, the LRU policy will actually insert the new block in the MRU position. So MRU stands for most recently used, LRU stands for least recently used. This is pretty intuitive. And there is another subtle sub policy, which is called the promotion policy, which is while you are inside the cache, if you are getting a hit, what will you do? Whether you will promote that block to MRU position or you will just keep it unaffected, right? So the simple textbook policy will actually keep the block in the MRU position because it's most recently used, right? Although this is a pretty straightforward, simple replacement policy, modern processors, they don't use LRU policy, at least at the last level cache. There is a variant there are various new cache replacement policies in the form of RRIP policies, which are used in the commercial machines. If you're interested, you can go and look at these policies, but I won't go into the detail of these policies. Okay. So something that you should also try it out with the understanding that we have so far. You know, given a cache of fixed size and associativity, and then let's say the input to the cache is a sequence of memory references. Can you write a program that will provide different kinds of cache misses, right? Keeping LRU as a replacement policy, can you quantify a particular reference is a capacity miss, it's a conflict miss, right? Or the compulsory miss. Compulsory miss is easy. The other two are a bit difficult, right? Try it out if you're sure that you get it. So let me know, right? So far, we have talked about the notion of cache size, associativity, and line size, but these three parameters should be, designed, or they should be used keeping the other trade-offs in mind. The latency, the energy power, the area, the complexity. which particular cache level you are interested in, whether you are interested in capacity, latency, bandwidth, the kind of misses that you may get, right? So these are just various terms that I'm throwing in just to give you an indication that fixing a particular parameter is not that easy. You have to keep on thinking about so many other trade-offs. Okay. So now let's look at how we can quantify performance of cache, right? So since it's a microarchitectural structure, and the simple way to compare the performance will be, okay, how many times I get a request, how many times I get a hit, which is like the hit rate of a cache, right? And the other extreme will be the miss rate. The miss rate is nothing but the reciprocal of hit rate, right? So instead of that, what I am saying is hit rate and miss rate, they are actually not a good metric to evaluate performance of cache, keeping the application or the program in mind, because both hit rate and miss rates are ratios, and they don't talk about how many instructions are actually executed when you are getting all these hits and misses. So for that reason, misses per kilo instructions, or MPKI in short, is actually used as a metric to evaluate how good is our cache or cache hierarchy, right? So it says for committing or executing 1,000 instructions, how many misses I got, right? So it's a better metric than the intuitive or the conventional hit rate, miss rate. And then once you understand the notion of hit rate and then the various kinds of events that comes into picture, right? Then you can also think about from a particular loads perspective. Okay, in the previous slide, I talked about from an application point of view whether the cache is doing good or not. Now you can actually think, assuming you are a load instruction, how much time it takes to get the data. If it's taking less time, that means you are getting a hit in the private caches or L1, L2 cache, and it's good, right? So to quantify that, there is a term called average memory access time, which is again pretty intuitive. You go to a particular cache, you do your tag comparison, index extraction. That's actually your hit time. Okay. Remember, you have to do this operation even if you are getting a miss, because unless you do this operation, you won't be able to know whether you are getting a hit or miss, right? And then there will be some probabilistic number, like what is the miss rate for that particular cache level, and what is the miss penalty, whether the data is coming from DRAM, L3 or L2. Ideally, all these three parameters should be low or maybe zero. Then the processor will be able to get the data in, let's say, 1 second, right? So that's the ideal world that we are talking about. So what will happen to this example that I have showed 45 minutes before? If every load request is getting let's say hit in the L1 cache, then all the other instructions which are waiting for the DRAM, they will be more than happy along with the load request, right? So that's kind of the dreamy world that we are seeing here. So there are so many other optimizations that you can look at through maybe standard textbooks, or you can go to my course webpage. I won't go into the details of all the optimizations in the interest of time. Instead, for next 15 minutes, I will talk about something that you will be using in your labs later in the afternoon. Okay. So we will have few questions on or few hands-on exercises on caching, whatever we have discussed. We'll also have something on hardware prefetching. So it's a technique which is widely used in modern processor to mitigate the memory wall problem. Okay. So what's the idea? So we have talked about processor, cache, and memory. Now we are introducing a notion of prefetcher. And as the name suggests, it fetches something before time, right? And what it does, it actually sits beside a cache and it observes the access patterns. Let's say in this case, x plus 1, x plus 2 is coming to the cache. The prefetcher can easily anticipate or speculate that, okay, there is some loop going on and I can actually go and prefetch x plus 3, right? So it will go and search whether x plus 3 is there in the cache. If not, go to DRAM, get the data corresponding to address x plus 3, so that in future when the processor demands for the data of address x plus 3, it will get a hit, right? So at a high level, it's actually a latency hiding technique, which is hiding the DRAM latency by fetching the data before time. Okay. 10,000 feet view of prefetching, as I mentioned, it's a latency hiding technique. How it speculates, well, you can think about, your branch predictors or any other predictors that Arka or Govind would have talked about yesterday. Right. Similarly, here prefetcher is just a predictor which predicts what are the future addresses my program will demand or may demand. Right. And there are two knobs of interest when someone talks about prefetcher. The first is prefetch degree, which says, on a given request which is coming from the processor, how many prefetch requests should I generate? Should I generate 1 request, 2 requests, or 4 requests? Is there a question? Okay. If not, so this is just a count which says, how aggressively you can actually go ahead in the future and get the data for future addresses. There is another knob called prefetch distance, which is, again, if you look at the definition of prefetch distance, it says, how far ahead of the access which is coming from the processor you should start prefetching. For example, if processor is sending a request to address X, and if you are prefetching for address Y, the gap between Y and X in terms of address space is actually the prefetch distance. Okay, so degree is just a count, how many prefetch requests you want to generate at a given point of time. Distance is the measure of, how futuristic you are in terms of speculating your prefetch request. Okay. So the distance can be anything depending on how aggressive you want to prefetch. Okay. So in the lab, what we will discuss is a pretty simple next line prefetcher, which is already implemented in commercial machines. You will find it in Intel and maybe AMD machines also. Idea is pretty simple. Whenever you get a miss to a particular address X, you prefetch X plus 1. That's why it's called next line, right? So the degree is 1 and the distance is 1. There is no big deal about this prefetcher, and we'll see more and more variants of this prefetcher maybe during the lab in today's afternoon, right? So as you can easily imagine that this will work well maybe at the private caches, L1 caches, which are closer to processor, but not for all the caches, because the access patterns will be filtered by the private caches, or you may be accessing a non-linear data structure like tree, graph, or whatever, right? So this is a vanilla prefetcher to start with, right? I'll pause here. I think there are some questions in between, so I can take them now.
Hello, sir.
Sir, I have a question, sir. Sir,
sure.
Can we utilize the time taken once instructions have been generated and stored in memory for prefetching?
Sorry, I think I didn't get it. What exactly is the question? Can we do what?
Sir, if the instructions need to be first stored in the memory, right?
The instruction, yes.
Yeah, so there will be a lot of time before which it is actually executed. So is it possible to utilize that whole time to prefetch all the memory required?
I think I'm not getting your question properly, but if I understand partly, you are saying we have opportunity in terms of some time interval where we can actually go and fetch the future instructions. Is that correct? Is that your question?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. If you have some kind of separate memory fetching processing unit in the memory, which is immediately once the instructions have been stored in the memory, it is starting to fetch the memory required for it.
Yeah, that is more or less the prefetcher. So you in the modern processors, you will have prefetchers for instruction cache, prefetchers for data cache. They do whatever you are suggesting now. So they actually look at the accesses which are coming to cache, and then depending on the time they have, they actually decide what to bring into the cache.
Oh, okay, sir. I'll just think a little more about that.
Sure.
Yes, sir.
Hello.
Yeah, please go on.
Yes, I was asking, we are talking about hit and miss, but there needs to be more flags so as to coordinate this process of fetching and prefetching, right? So what those flags might be?
No, there are no flags here. So are you talking about some kind of register flags or I'm getting you wrong?
No, I'm not saying flags as in literally flags, but as we say that there is a hit and there is a miss, and then we move on to the next set of tasks which is associated with caches. So apart from hit or miss, there might be some other terms, right, which will for basically for communication, so that it doesn't interfere.
So this is, I got it. I think I got it. So this is just a design choice, right? You can also have information about replacement. You can also have information about whether whatever you have brought into cache, they are actually useful, which is nothing but the accuracy of a prefetcher, right? Yeah, so this is a design choice. So at a primer, this lecture is at a pretty high level, so I didn't go into all the details. But yeah, there are many possibilities.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Sir, I have made some observation. Can you please let me know if it is incorrect or correct?
Sure.
When we are considering multi-word cache access, right? So when we are doing prefetching, we can afford to keep the prefetch distance large.
The prefetch distance is actually keeping in mind how many cycles my prefetcher will need to get the data from DRAM. Okay, so for example, if you take a for loop, if you are in, let's say, iteration I, and then let's say to get the data from DRAM, let's say it takes 200 cycles, you can actually come up with an equation that can say that, okay, if you go and start fetching for, let's say, iteration K, then that will be useful because, I to K itself is kind of 200 cycles. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. But for example, when we're doing multi-word access, so say I've already fetched.
We don't do multi-word prefetching, right? So we have the notion of lines, right? So lines are anyway multi-word by default, by definition, right? So we prefetch your lines, not a few bytes or few words.
Okay, no, I couldn't explain it. For example, initially we get a cold miss. So we fetched multi-word cache, not prefetched it. So initially we have fetched the multi-word once. And then, for example, in the loop one only, for kth, we've already fetched. So what I essentially meant to ask was that since we already fetched some of the iterations, we can keep the prefetch distance large.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. So it's a dynamic parameter, right? So depending on how deep you have already prefetched, based on that, you can decide your prefetch distance. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thanks. Okay, then let's move on. Maybe last few slides. So far we have been discussing about single core, but modern systems, even your mobile phones, are multi-core systems in today's world, right? So nothing changes in terms of cache hierarchy drastically, but you will start seeing that there is a structure which is shared by all the processors, right? So what I'm showing here is there is a private L1 or L2 cache for each processor. They are running their own processes. And the last level cache, which is L3, it's shared by all the cores. Okay. So you can actually start asking, like, well, why we have this private cache, shared cache? Why not have just one big cache and then let's provide it to everyone, right? So latency is one of the parameters, or latency is one of the trade-offs that we have to think about. The other trade-off is the bandwidth, right? We can't have a big cache and assume that, okay, all the cores will actually use it at all the levels. It's like the example that I have been giving from last few years. There are multiple monkeys. There are many monkeys. They are trying to eat one banana. That will be the case if you have one big gigantic cache where all the cores want to access it, right? It's a bandwidth problem. So instead, if you have a private cache at the L1, L2 level and a shared cache at the last level cache, right? Then what you can have is there are some applications which are pretty tiny, right? They don't demand too much memory, so they are fitting into your private caches, and you can actually go for the full space utilization for some applications which are, let's say, demanding more than their private cache. So it's kind of a win-win combination, which means if some application is not demanding LLC, it's not underutilized because LLC can be used by other applications. And If you go for a private LLC, then that will be underutilized. That will be a waste of space, right? Another subtle point that I want to mention here, last level cache, though it's actually shared by all, because the capacity is huge, it's in MBs, tens of MBs, it again creates the issue of latency and bandwidth, right? So instead of using a big monolithic last level cache, in the modern processor, you will find sliced last level cache. So the example that I want to provide here is, for example, let's assume that we have an 8 MB cache, 8 MB last level cache. Instead of a big 8 MB cache, now we can have 4 2 MB caches in the form of slice 0, slice 1, slice 2, slice 3. But remember, all these slices are accessed by all the processors. It's nothing like this is private to some core, right? The latency will be different depending on which slice is closer to which core, but all the slices are accessible or anyone can access all these slices. Okay, that's why the shared property is still maintained. A few other crucial points in the context of multi-cores and cache hierarchy. So when we design a multi-level cache hierarchy, there are various ways through which we can actually fill our data from memory. So the simple way is when you fill your data from memory, you fill it in LLC and L2 or L1, right? And you can also enforce that whatever data I have in my private L1, L2, that should be there in my LLC, right? So this is called as the inclusive cache. It's like LLC is a superset of private L1, L2. And to maintain that inclusivity, what you have to do is anytime the replacement policy evicts something from the LLC, you have to go back and invalidate or let's say evict that block from the private caches just to maintain the inclusivity. Okay. Non-inclusive, which is kind of pretty common in commercial machines in the today's world, there is no binding between different levels of cache. So you can actually fill the data into both LLC and L1, L2. And if you evict something from the LLC, there is no need to go and check in the private caches and no need to evict or invalidate. Okay. The other extreme is the exclusive cache hierarchy. Few machines have it, but it's extremely complicated because for multi-core systems, exclusive cache hierarchy can become a nightmare for various reasons that may Arka or Govind will talk about. So here the idea is on a response from memory, you don't put it in the last level cache or L3, you directly put it in the private cache L1, L2. When you evict something from the private L1, L2, you put it in the last level cache. Okay, so this is helpful if you want to improve your effective cache capacity across all the cache levels, right? You can easily see that exclusive is better in terms of the effective cache capacity, but it has its own issues. Maybe the next week lectures on multi-core will be able to provide you more insights. But for today's lecture, keep this in mind because I'll be using it again during the security lectures and then why these hierarchies are important. Okay. So far, our view of memory hierarchies, we have a processor, we have a memory, we introduce different levels of caches, and they have different latency numbers. But we haven't talked about the notion of the address which is generated by the processor. Okay, whether this address is something called a physical address, whether it's a virtual address. Well, Arka will talk about it in the next session, right? What exactly is virtual address, why you need virtual address, and then how does caching or how cache hierarchy will be designed keeping virtual address in mind. Okay, so like stay tuned for the next lecture by Arka. So with that, I will stop. I'll also like to mention few links of interest. Go and look at the latest microarchitectures from, let's say, Intel and see what are their cache sizes, there's associativity, what kind of policy they use, and blah, blah, blah. There are a few funny videos that my students have prepared through a course on architecture at IITB. Go and look at that. You can correlate with the real life activities. Okay. Research questions on cache hierarchy, it's still a hot topic, and with the emerging applications coming from, let's say, ML, vision, graph processing, there's a need for domain-specific memory or cache hierarchy. Non-volatile caches are kind of becoming, the new hotcakes, I would say. It may become practical in few years, right? There are various other interesting questions like how OS should interact, how microarchitecture should be designed for data centers, keeping virtualization in mind, and blah, blah, blah. So look at some of the top, papers from these forums, which are some of the top conferences in the field of computer architecture, and if something is interesting to you. Okay. So with that, I will stop. We still have 4 minutes, and I can take few questions. Thank you.
Sir?
Yes, please go on.
Sir, is it possible for core 0 to access the data present in the local cache of core 1?
I think I will delay answering that. Maybe Arka will answer next week. Okay. It's possible, provided they are actually part of the same address space, they are sharing a data structure. Okay.
And sir, one more question I have. Same slide.
Same slide. Oh, okay. Sorry.
So, how will that core 2 or any core decide that data present in the shared case will be in the S2 or S3 or S1 means?
No, they don't decide. Usually there will be some hashing functions or indexing functions that we have discussed so far, right? So there is no guarantee that your data will be there in a particular slice, right? Okay. That's why you have to actually go and probe for the indexing bits. The modern machines that have during indexing, it will actually indirectly give you the slice number, which slice number the data is present. Okay. It's a bit complicated hash function that's why I'm not discussing, but you can assume that your indexing operation is kind of providing you the information about the slice.
Okay. So, sir, one more thing, splitting these things now, splitting these L3 cache into 4, don't you think that it will be difficult to decide as compared to if it is only one? Means
I gave you that example, right? If you have a big 8 MB or 16 MB or maybe 32 MB cache, the latency will be higher. And secondly, now you won't be able to provide concurrent accesses coming from multiple cores, right? It's a multi-core system now, right?
That will be parallelly accessible.
Yeah. So now it's actually providing you a leeway, right? Through which you can actually access multiple slices concurrently.
Okay. Yeah. So what is that hash function you are talking about?
The hash function is nothing but a function used for indexing. Okay. I will share the hash function. This is already reverse engineered. I'll be able to share a link maybe after the talk.
Oh, okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Sir,
we have 1 minute, I guess.
Yes, sir. Sir, the basic idea of cache is to improve the performance of the core, right? But wouldn't having a shared cache actually be inefficient in terms of performance because we will be having more cache misses?
No, it's a trade-off questions, right? So as I have mentioned before, a shared cache is providing you an opportunity where if a particular application is not using the last level cache, the other application can use it, right? But if you go for a private cache, then that particular chunk of last level cache is completely wasted, right? You are wasting that space.
Right. So when a core is trying to access some data, but a different core is also trying to access that, then wouldn't that cause a problem?
Okay, that's an advanced topic that again Govind and Arka will talk about next week. So what you are asking is two different cores trying to access the same address.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So I will delay answering that. Maybe Arka or Govind will answer it next week.
I'm not. I'm actually in the memory consistency model. And
oh, okay. Then Govind will ask. Govind will answer, right?
So I think Madhu will answer. It's okay.
Oh, Madhu. Oh, okay. Cool. Okay. Okay, then if there are other questions, we can take it later in the afternoon. Thanks again. So I'm stopping my.
Thank you, Biswa, for the interesting lecture.
Thanks, Vishwesh.
Now we have the next lecture from Professor Arka. He will talk on virtual memory management. Yeah, we can see the slide.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, and we can see the screen also.
Let me know. Should I actually get started?